Part 1. The heavy silence. Elias had spent a decade mastering the art of the unheard. As a senior field recordist for Soundscape Corp., he had traveled from the suffocating humidity of the Amazon to the sterile, wind-whipped plateaus of Antarctica. He believed he knew silence in all its forms. But as he stood on the jagged edge of the Cape of Broken Hopes, he realized he was a novice. Here, the silence was not an absence, but a presence. It felt like a physical weight, a thick, invisible shroud of salt and ancient dampness that pressed against his eardrums. The Atlantic lay before him, a vast expanse of slate-gray glass, moving with a heavy, oily lethargy. The fog was an absolute wall, erasing the horizon and leaving Elias trapped in a world that felt no larger than a few hundred yards of sharp granite and crashing foam. He adjusted the heavy straps of his gear, the leather groaning against his parka. Every sound he made, the crunch of wet shingle under his boots, the metallic click of his tripod legs, felt like a violation of a sacred, dormant peace. He set up his array of high-sensitivity shotgun microphones, pointing them toward the black, jagged maw of a sea cave at the base of the cliffs. He slid his monitor headphones on, and the world transformed. Through the electronics, the silence exploded. He could hear the microscopic hiss of sea foam dissolving on the rocks and the rhythmic, deep tissue thrum of the earth itself. It was the perfect recording. It was pure. But then, as he adjusted the gain, a new frequency bled into the mix. It was a thin, whistling sigh. It didn't waver like the wind, it had a rhythmic, biological precision. Inhale. A 4-second pause. Exhale. Elias felt the hair on his arms rise. He checked his cables, fearing a ground loop or radio interference, but the sound remained, growing clearer as the sun began to dip behind the fog. He leaned toward the cave and shouted, "Is anyone there?" His voice was swallowed instantly, but in his headphones, the response came 3 seconds later. In the gap between his words and the echo, a hoarse, toneless whisper vibrated through the silicon of his earpieces. It didn't use sound waves, it felt like it was speaking directly to the copper wires of his mind. It said only one thing. Listen. Terrified, Elias packed his gear with trembling hands. He scrambled up the cliffside path toward the only light in the mist, the flickering orange glow of a shack owned by a local hermit named Thomas. The interior of the cabin was a graveyard of maritime history, smelling of dried cod, ancient tobacco, and rot. Thomas sat by a hearth that held more ash than flame. He didn't turn when Elias entered. "You've been to the Singing Stones," the old man said, his voice a dry rasp that mirrored the sea. "You brought your machines to hear what should remain buried." He explained that the stones were not natural, they were a prehistoric focus, a flute carved into the coastline to play the frequencies of a world beneath our own. "Do not record after the light fails, boy," Thomas warned, his eyes like two dark voids. "The echo is hungry. It doesn't just mimic the living. It harvests them." Part 2. The Archive of the Lost. Elias spent the night in a feverish state, the whisper from the cave looping in his mind. Driven by a mix of professional obsession and a growing, irrational dread, he began to explore the cabin. Under a stack of rotted fishing nets, he discovered a heavy iron chest. Inside were dozens of reel-to-reel tapes and a tattered, salt-stained diary. The name on the cover sent a jolt through him. Marcus Vane. Marcus had been the industry's legend, the man who had pioneered field recording before disappearing without a trace 20 years ago. Elias began to read the frantic, sprawling handwriting. Marcus had discovered that the Cape wasn't just a place of echoes, it was a biological storage device. The granite was rich in quartz crystals that had been tuned to record every vibration that ever touched the shore. "The stones are a mirror," one entry read. "They reflect not your image, but your sonic soul. I have recorded my mother, my father, and a version of myself that hasn't been born yet. To create a sound, the echo must consume the source. It requires a body to act as a resonance chamber." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The diary described how the voices on the tapes became clearer as the people on the shore became quieter. He looked at the tapes, hundreds of hours of lost people. Thomas appeared in the shadows of the room, his presence as silent as a ghost. He told Elias that Marcus hadn't died, he had simply run out of sound. They had found him sitting on the shore, his mouth open in a permanent scream, but not even a whisper could escape his lips. He was an empty vessel, his voice now residing in the stones. Despite the visceral horror of the diary, Elias felt a pull he couldn't resist. He was a scientist of sound, and the ultimate recording was within his reach. He returned to the singing stones as a blood-red dawn broke through the haze. He bypassed his standard filters and tapped into the infrasound spectrum, the frequencies below the range of human hearing. The moment he hit record, the air around him seemed to thicken. His headphones began to hum with a vibration that made his teeth ache. He heard a voice, his own voice, recounting his most private memories. He heard himself crying as a child, he heard the private whispers he had shared with lovers years ago. It was all there, being played back by the rocks. Then, the recording shifted. The voice in his ears began to describe the present. "He is standing by the tripod," the voice said, sounding exactly like Elias. "He is afraid. He is wondering if he will ever leave this shore. He is feeling his vocal cords begin to calcify." Elias tried to yell, to break the loop, but the sound that left his mouth was weak, muffled, as if he were shouting underwater. The recorder's display began to glow with an intense, unnatural light. The waveform on the screen wasn't a jagged line of sound, it was a series of perfect, interlocking circles. The stones around him began to glow with a dull, subterranean bioluminescence. He wasn't just recording the echo anymore, he was being synchronized with it. Part 3. The architecture of noise. The world began to fracture. Elias ripped the headphones from his head, but the sound didn't stop. It was no longer coming from the electronics, it was coming from the air, the ground, and his own bones. He fell into a terrifying state of sensory displacement. He could no longer hear the external world, the wind and the waves had gone mute, but he could hear the internal mechanics of his own body with agonizing clarity. He heard the sluicing of blood through his valves like a rushing river. He heard the electrical crackle of his synapses. He heard the slow, grinding friction of his bones. He was becoming a prisoner of his own biology, while the world outside became a silent, flickering projection. He tried to flee, stumbling over the slick rocks, but the geography of the cape had warped. Space was no longer measured in distance, but in frequency. Every time he tried to move away from the singing stones, the pitch of the hum in his head increased, pinning him to the spot. He was trapped in an acoustic cage. He looked down at his hands and saw them vibrating, their outlines blurring as if he were a low-resolution image. The fog around him began to take shape, forming towering, translucent pillars that mimicked the granite stones. They were structures of pure sound, an architecture built from the harvested voices of the thousands who had perished in these waters over millennia. He dragged himself back to Thomas' shack, desperate for human contact, for a sound that wasn't a reflection. But the cabin was gone. In its place stood a hollow shell of mist. He saw Thomas sitting in his chair, but the old man was no longer human. He was a visual echo, a loop of light and shadow. As Elias watched, Thomas' face dissolved into a swirling vortex of gray smoke, and from the center of that vortex came the sound of 1,000 drowning men. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Thomas wasn't the guardian of the shore, he was the shore's lure. He was a recording designed to put the victims at ease until the stones could finish their work. Elias turned back to the ocean. The water was receding, revealing a forest of black, crystalline spires rising from the seabed. They were humming in perfect unison, a colossal choir that shook the very foundations of the earth. His recorder, still clutched in his hand, reached 99% capacity. The device was hot enough to blister his skin, but he couldn't drop it. It was no longer a tool, it was the bridge. The echo reached out, a physical wave of distorted pressure, and began to pull. He felt his memories, his language, his very names for things being stripped away. He was being unmade, translated from a man of flesh into a sequence of data to be stored in the granite archive. Part 4. The final frequency. The transition was not a death, but a change in state. At the exact moment the recorder hit 100%, the world exploded into a blinding white frequency. Elias felt his consciousness expand, shattering into a million different directions. He saw the history of the Cape, not as a timeline, but as a massive, shimmering chord. He saw the ships that had broken on these rocks, heard the final prayers of the sailors, and felt the cold embrace of the quartz as it took their stories. He was no longer a person named Elias, he was a single note in a symphony that had been playing since the cooling of the earth. His physical body was gone, replaced by a permanent vibration in the stone. The following morning, the sun rose over a cape that was unnaturally still. The fog had lifted, revealing a coastline of haunting beauty. There was no sign of a struggle, no tripod, no gear, only a small, melted plastic casing half buried in the sand. A salvage team from Soundscape Corp arrived 3 days later, led by a young engineer who had idolized Elias. They found the village, which appeared to have been abandoned for decades, not days. The air was so quiet it felt unnatural, like a room where the air had been sucked out. They found the recorder near the singing stones, its screen cracked and its internals fused, but the solid-state drive was miraculously intact. Back in the laboratory in New York, the team gathered around the console. They were looking for answers, for a clue to their colleague's disappearance. The lead engineer initiated the playback. For the first several minutes, there was only the peaceful sound of the Atlantic. Then, the audio began to shift. The noise floor dropped to zero, and a voice emerged, Elias' voice, but layered with a harmonic depth that no human throat could produce. "It is finished," the voice said, sounding like a cathedral organ made of glass. "The archive is complete. I am no longer waiting. I am the sound." As the staff listened, the lights in the studio began to flicker in time with the waveform. The engineer tried to pause the recording, but the buttons didn't respond. The sound began to bleed out of the speakers and into the walls of the building. One by one, the people in the room stopped speaking. They found they couldn't even if they wanted to. Their voices were being drawn toward the speakers, pulled into the digital file like water into a vacuum. On the monitor, a new recording session opened automatically. The echo had moved beyond the cape. It had found a digital nervous system to inhabit. As the recording light turned red, the city of New York began to go quiet, one block at a time, as the great chord began its next movement.